Hey everyone, my guest today is Adam Gries. Together with Nathan Chang, he founded Vitalism. Vitalism is a moral philosophy and community of people that are working on longevity and that want to solve aging. When Adam and Nathan realized that there's no unified community of people trying to solve aging, they founded Vitalism to give people the space to be connected and to actually pull their powers together and work together on this problem. Later, Adam is going to talk more about how and why they founded this community. Today, we're also going to talk about network states and pop-up cities. The idea of a network state is that people that are unified under a common moral belief, like for example, death is bad, or under a common interest, come together. And this maybe first happens in an online community, but then it happens in the form of maybe a pop-up city. So that means they come together for an extended period of time, like 100 people for 2 months or for 6 weeks or whatever. And later they maybe even move together to have a permanent place where those people have their own jurisdiction, their own government, and their own independent maybe city, maybe country, or whatever. Specifically, we're going to talk about 3 different pop-up cities. 2 in the past, those are Zulu, which was the first one where this was ever done. Second one, Vitalia, which is primarily only focused on aging. And the third one is in the future. It's going to happen soon in Berlin. It's called Zelar.City. And Zelar, like Vitalia, also has this main focus on solving aging. So for 6 weeks, all the people that are going to live there in the middle of Berlin are unified under the goal that they want to solve aging. But now, enjoy my conversation with Adam Gries. I would really like to hear your personal story of motivation. Like, what was the process that got you to work on longevity and try to stop aging?
Well, been curious about the human condition, the true nature of reality. So I investigated that in different ways, growing up through meditation and later in college by learning psychology and then neuroscience. And when I heard about longevity escape velocity in 2005 and the context of using science and technology to solve aging, I just thought that was obviously a good idea and that we should do something about aging and death, particularly about death. Because why would you want to die if life is so great and there's so much yet to be discovered and to explore? And of course, aging is a particularly gruesome way to die. So that's like adding insult to injury. When you open your eyes to that fact, it's very hard to close them. And so starting then, decided that I would dedicate a large amount of energy to try to solve death and aging, which is the principal cause of death. And so a lot of my journey has been in the context of seeking the right time and manner in which to affect that interest. So, initially I thought, okay, well, I should build up my skills and career. And then at some point I realized, okay, it's time to dedicate the majority of my attention to this topic. So that's kind of the concise path that I took. And it took 13 years or so from the moment that I realized that this was the most important thing until I felt ripe to dedicate my entire attention to it.
With Nathan Chang, together you are the founders of Vitalism. What is the founding story of Vitalism? Like, how did you guys get together and came up with the idea to build this community?
Yeah, so Nathan and I first connected in March of 21. I was looking to meet people who were concerned about death and aging, and I quickly found Nathan online. It may have been somebody recommending his newsletter or just like running into one of his tweets. And I followed him and I pinged him cold. And we hopped on a Zoom within 24 hours and discussed kind of our respective, perspectives about the longevity space and challenge. And that kicked off basically a year and a half where we were collaboratively struggling with the situation and what to do about it. And what I mean by situation is that it seemed that we were hardly making any progress, and that if nothing changed, we were pretty much as good as dead. And so, when we looked at that, we really kind of like surveyed the different initiatives in longevity on the scientific front and reached the common conclusion that none of them were promising enough to give us enough confidence that we could just like sit back and everything would be fine. In fact, on the contrary, it felt like there was no promise at all. And it was very likely that all these efforts would fail. And so when you look at that, could be a source of dejection, or it could be a reason to kind of stop thinking about it or lean into some sort of hopium or copium. But I guess both Nathan and I are very pragmatic. And so we tried to think, well, okay, what is the highest leverage thing we could do to change this situation? And the first principles, most self-evident thing is that we're not really trying to solve aging with science and technology. We meaning humanity, right? If you think about all of our resources, the community, we're all dying of aging. All of our loved ones are dying of aging. Sucks. And if you look at how we allocate resources in society, we basically pretend that that's not happening. So we do that in two ways. On the one hand, we say, well, what's more important is, defense spending or some subsidy for an agricultural lobby, or you name it, or subsidizing pharma, or all sorts of things like that. So that's horrible. But, some of these things might make sense, but the ratio is completely skewed in a nonsensical way. And then the other side of it is just that we have this status quo where by inertia, society says we're doing our best in the way that we spend our money on quote unquote healthcare, really sick care, and on aging. And therefore, there's no point in doing anything differently. Actually, this is the best we can do. And so when we saw that, we would say, well, okay, so there are a couple of hypotheses that stand at the base of this, right? You're kind of assuming, well, waiting for people to get sick and then trying to solve some late stage pathology, as we do with cancer, heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and more, is the current quote unquote state of the art. So you could say that humanity is actually trying very hard to keep people alive and to extend lifespans. Right now, it is actually doing that. It's just doing it in a very ridiculous way. So that's where we spend all our money. And so you could say, oh, humanity doesn't care about extending lifespans. That's not really true. Humanity really does care about extending lifespans in the revealed preference. Even though people on the street might say, oh, I'm fine with dying at 80, the revealed preference of society is to spend like $1 trillion a year to try to extend lifespans. Except the way we do that is in the context of pathology, where the body is completely broken. So really what we're saying is that our critique is that our resource allocation is faulty, not because we're not trying hard to fight against aging and death. It's that the way we're trying is wrong. And if we want to try hard in an effective way, we need to solve the root cause problem. And the root cause problem of death is aging. And to solve aging, you can't just look at a late state pathology. The chances of solving aging are just like infinitesimally small if you do that, in our opinion. And so then you're basically saying, well, you do need a big resource allocation in society that moves from this mental model of we're doing the best we can do with pathologies to we're going to think long term and try to solve things at the root. And so if you think about a massive reallocation of resources in that way, it really takes a kind of shift in influence in power dynamics in society, right? Because the current state is not a result of like one agent or one dictator or one lawmaker. It's this entire very complex system where pharma has a role, patient groups have a role, lawmakers have a role, legacy institutions have a role, agencies that were given a mandate that was relevant for 100 years ago have a role. And in combination, even if every stakeholder is trying to be ethical which sometimes they're not, but let's even imagine they are, you would have this very negative outcome. And so that led us to think, all right, well, we need a kind of revolution. Like when have so many things changed? Typically it's in a state of real disruption to the fabric of culture, the politic, and society. And so it typically happens in these kind of religious or political revolutions. And that's what made us come up with vitalism, because we felt that we need a unifying ideology and a name that could coordinate the people who want to see this revolution and then help us work collaboratively to drive the revolution forward.
What do you think is the role of network states and pop-up cities, like, for example, Zelar.City, towards the progress on solving aging?
It's an important experiment in a context which is hard to predict. So when you think about longevity states, really all we're saying is that the scope of the change we want needs to happen at the state level. And that doesn't actually mean country or state or special economic zone or jurisdiction. It just means that when you think about trying hard as humanity, there are a few dimensions that typically only happen at the highest level of organization. And that's typically the state or the jurisdiction. And what are these dimensions? They're financing, they are regulations, and they are status and acceptability and education. And so if you want to, even if we had all the money in the world, but the regulator said, you just can't test this thing, well, that doesn't get us anywhere, or it's very limiting. And even if we had all the money in the world, but society says, you're stupid if you go and study aging, because that's a waste of time. And it's like some selfish, immoral thing to study. Instead, you should study cancer. And then none of the bright minds go to study aging. They all go to study cancer, or they all go to optimize click-through rates for some like SaaS product. Obviously, it doesn't help you that you have all that money. You just don't have the brains to come up with ideas to iterate on stuff and make the discoveries. So the state, the concept of the state is the idea that you need to unify these dimensions at a high level. And so when you think about pop-up cities and other kind of congregations of people, whether they be at a network state level, where people of similar predilections communicate and connect together, affect influence, and get secure kind of some outcome or some benefit or some desired change in the world for their community, what you're really talking about is just a way for people to try to accelerate their path to influence at this kind of higher level. So if you think about a pop-up city, the benefits of it fall into a few categories. One, it creates an artificial majority of the category that you're looking at. So if we're talking about a longevity pop-up city, now, even though society at large might say we're doing the best we can, as soon as you enter the pop-up city, suddenly the majority of people are telling you, no, it's the opposite. We're not doing the best we can. We should do something completely different. And so the normative perspective becomes different and offers permission for somebody to think outside the box and challenges somebody to think outside the box, and also creates a safe place for people to brainstorm about ideas that might be considered disruptive or unusual or different. And typically the ideas that drive change are by definition considered disruptive or unusual at first because they're not the mainstream position, right? So pop-up cities, by creating that artificial density and artificial majority, are providing a catalyst for acceleration of all these types of ideas. Secondly, they create a unified physical space, which with density, that could serve as precursor for actual communities. So, for example, in Prospero with Vitalia, they're trying to build an actual city which will be of a certain orientation over time. And so by doing a pop-up city, they're planting a seed and they want to expand that seed and actually demonstrate, hey, it's great to live here collaboratively. It's great to have values that we believe in expressed on a day-to-day basis around people who share the same values, right? And common interests. And so you could imagine these pop-up cities actually serving as seeds for communities, neighborhoods, and other types of congregations physically that would have political and other influence. Those are a few of the key reasons I think pop-up cities are important to catalyze these kind of changes.
For you personally, have you ever joined a project that is similar, like Zelar.City?
Well, I was at Vitalia and I was at Zuzalu before that. So I had some experience of these kind of events. But I will say that until Zeller, there's never been a pop-up city of any appreciable size, and certainly not one dedicated to longevity in a major city. So when you look at Vitalia or Zuzalu or Edge Esmeralda or other very interesting and inspiring projects, they typically have been outside the major cities. And while that has some advantage in creating some distance from people's normal day to day, and it may be easier to craft a particular type of experience by getting the space outside the city, one of the downsides of that is doesn't demonstrate what this could look like in places people already live and work. And that's really important to demonstrate, because if we want to create change in existing jurisdictions and in existing cities, we want to enable people to engage with these ideas easily. And that means they don't need to fly somewhere far like Honduras or go somewhere like Montenegro to a seaside resort town. They can stay at their job, at the lab at the university or at the company they work at, and they can still be part of this community and a very, let's say, dense group of change making. And in that context, I think this is a really important and first of its kind experiment.
How was your experience like joining those other pop-up cities?
Well, it was very inspiring to be around the curated set of people from a variety of frontier technologies and areas of thought. The density and the kind of context that was created in both of those experiences, Vitalia and Zuzalu, the serendipity and the fact that you were somewhat removed from the major cities actually made it so the community was in some ways more intimate and had a higher frequency of these impromptu interactions, right? And more, let's say, community activities, right? If you're in this seaside resort and there's like a cold plunge and some sort of exercise thing, and there are a few options, you're not going to go and just randomly go to, your favorite, whatever hot yoga place in Berlin or whatever your other favorite preferred activity is, because you're already in that venue and context. And so I think that created more intimacy and more intensity, and those are good things. It also felt somewhat artificial because both of these events happened in areas which are really converted resorts or resorts that were used for the purpose of the event. And that made them feel somewhat conference-y rather than, hey, this could be a way of life. You could be a permanent resident here and you might actually move your family here and, just imagine building a long-term life in this venue. And so I found that to be missing, but I also think that wasn't necessarily the goal of these events. In addition, both Zuzalu and Italia had a mix of frontier technologies, whereas Zeller and some of the other initiatives that are coming up are more specific, in this case tailored to longevity, in other cases possibly tailored to other areas.
I was reading about Vitalist Bay, which is a pop-up city organized by Vitalism. Can you maybe explain this a bit?
Yeah, so it's organized by Vitalism Foundation, whose goal is to accelerate the Vitalism movement. It's one Vitalist organization. Basically, the way we think about it is, we wanted to do a pop-up city, and we were looking for a venue that would have the highest leverage. And the Bay Area stood out because it possibly has the highest density of longevity and specifically Vitalist orientation. today. And also, it has a very high prevalence of high net worth and ultra high net worth innovators. So these are people who made their money in technology of one or another flavor and maybe open-minded to longevity or interested in longevity, but not involved and not engaged to a substantial degree, whether in capital allocation or in overall attention. And so putting center of gravity in the Bay Area, where you have that manufactured density and majority of people who care about longevity in the way that we do, and inviting the communities in the Bay Area of people who may be open-minded to this and have a lot of leverage in their respective communities or areas of innovation, I think could drive a huge amount of capital, attention, and leverage to what we do. And so that was the reasoning behind it.
Let's say a small group of dedicated engineers would come up to you and they want to contribute to this fight against aging, and they would ask for your advice. What would you advise them to work on? Let's say it's like a few people that are able to code, like maybe some people that are with marketing, and like a group that could form up in, for example, Zelar or another.
I'll answer this in two ways, one of which is a bit of a cop-out. So okay. I don't presume to know what the best projects are. I would advise such a person or such a group of engineers to join Vitalism Foundation as members, and then connect with different people, go to programs like Longevity Biotech Fellowship, and further connect with people, get exposed to the different things people are working on, and also see where those problems intersect with their skills and passion, right? Because even a specific engineer or somebody with a skill set may have a preference and a passion and a certain kind of creative skill or predilection, and it's very hard to predict that ahead of time. Now, that's a bit of a cop-out, even though I think it is the right thing to do. So if somebody is in that position, I would advise them to do that. Now, of course, they could hop on a call with me or with somebody who's, let's say, pretty well informed in the space and could brainstorm together to maybe shortcut that to find some specific match, right? Now, the other answer to that is more, let's say, specific answer that is just what I happen to be aware of / am excited by recently. And that may or may not be the best thing. So, with that dose of humility, I'll say, I think that automation is really interesting in data collection and labs. So there's this idea that you could reimagine how lab experiments are done and combine AI, robotics, and biology in some sort of warehouse or cross-pollinated ecosystem and build out the data collection / experimentation layer of the future using those different technologies, because there'll be some specialization to tie them all together. Beyond that, for software engineers, there may be opportunities in figuring out how to collect data more effectively and then analyze it, because there's a bunch of data that exists. So for example, biobanks have data. Some of that data is not normalized to other biobanks, and it may benefit from enrichment with additional data sources, whether from other biobanks or from other data, and then making that available, I think could be useful. Those are a couple of ideas that come to mind, but there's much more. And, I was leaning into this direction of kind of like software orientation or AI and robotics, just given the nature of the question. But of course, there's a lot to do with kind of more wet biology. That being said, because that hasn't been like my area of professional experience as much, I would advise just talking to people who are working on that, because they do need software support as well.
You have been working in the longevity field for a while now. What would you say is one learning that is like standing out, some change in your perception of the world that you think is meaningful to know for people?
People's attitudes towards aging are hidden by many layers of distraction and deflection. To rephrase that, or to add color to that, when you start thinking about the problem of aging and death at a very superficial layer, your initial thought might be confusion. Oh, we're all dying. How is it that nobody is realizing this problem, right? Why doesn't anybody care? Am I just like in the void? And then you meet somebody who cares, and it's like, all right, well, there's one person who cares. And then you're like, oh, well, then you get to another layer, and it's like, well, a lot of people care about aging, but they care about it in a very specific way. Like, it's like they superficially care about, preventing the visible signs of aging. And then some people care about their performance. And it's kind of like every answer you get is this superficial additional layer. And as you dig, you peel down that layer and you get to another layer and you get to another layer. And even if the bottom layer that you got to is actually quite a simple point, it's often labyrinthian to get to it. So the simple point that I would articulate, which is one big learning that I have, and the reason I put it this way is because when I tell you this learning, you'll be like, well, that's obvious. You didn't need to tell me this story to tell me this learning. The learning is humans are just super short-termists. So, you'd be like, well, duh, look at the stock market. People just optimize for the next quarter. Or like, look at people's impulse control when they use TikTok, like zero impulse control. Or look at like, sexy content online or whatever, right? So, or clickbait, right? So like that's so obvious, but it's actually one of the primary drivers of everything here. So when you think ultimately about like, okay, why don't people care? Well, first of all, for most people, aging and death are very far away. It's like you're boiling a frog in water. They don't notice it on a day-to-day basis. And you're like telling them, oh, you're going to die in like 50 years. They're like, oh, 50 years from now, I don't need to worry about that right now, or 70 years from now. So it's like, it's impossible for them to grapple with it. And when you think about the nature of humanity in general, Peter Fetichev and I had this conversation. He's the founder of Giro, which is an important longevity company. And, we're talking about how humans in a way reset daily because like we go to sleep and then it's almost like our instance of consciousness continuity ends at the end of the day and then it's reapplied at the next day. And that inherently, because of our biology, makes it hard to put ourselves in the shoes of a future instance. And the farther away the instance, the harder it is to imagine that scenario, right? When we think about ourselves tomorrow, it's already difficult to imagine. So let's just imagine you're in the morning of day X, right? Just to make that idea more tangible. So you wake up at 6 a.m. and I tell you, hey, Elias, we're going to go for sushi. I booked a special sushi restaurant for you and me. It's going to be great. It has your favorite sushi. It's going to be fatty toro and ikura. I know you love that. Okay, you're already imagining the flavor of the sushi. You're like, wow, sushi at the end of the day, that sounds great. I look forward to it, right? Now, that sushi is like 13 hours removed from you at that point. Even just saying like in the evening, you're planning the next day feels so far removed. You know what I mean? Like if it's 6 p.m., you're thinking about your brunch the next morning. It's like, yeah, it sounds good, but it feels a lot more abstract. Yeah, I'm going to go to brunch tomorrow morning. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a great brunch. I know it's going to be great, etc. But it's kind of like, you're approaching that sleep reset. And so it's not as tangible. Anybody, if they observe themselves, can see and kind of feel that change in tangibility. So when you extend it to thinking about something that'll happen like in a week or in a month, it's just so funny because we're actually incapable of connecting with the reality of that. Like we're biologically almost hardwired to make it difficult to conceive and imagine ourselves in these positions. And so when you ask somebody a question like, how long do you want to live? When they say 80 or 70 or 90, they're actually not able to interpret the question. Like if you take their answer at face value, you're actually doing them a disservice, because they never answer the question at all, because they're not capable of imagining themselves in 50 years. Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. You just asked them to do the impossible. It's like asking a 5-year-old, describe to me the theory of relativity, or describe to me the concept of infinity. They'll just be like, what are you talking about? That's actually what you're doing. But because you're asking the question in a way that sounds very familiar with simple numbers, oh, how long do you want to live? And they can pull some number out of their ear, which sounds like a rational number, then you feel like you got an answer, but actually you didn't get an answer. The question was kind of like the wrong question, right? And then on the other hand, it's also true that people who don't answer with a number are likely going to be more open-minded to extend lifespans. So it's almost like you're keeping these two ideas in mind, right? On the one hand, people are not geared to conceive of long-term stuff. On the other hand, some people have a tendency to prioritize life. So when confronted with a long-term question, their bias is to prioritize life. So they'll say, I want to live as long as possible, and they won't cut it. But it's not because they can actually put themselves in the shoes of that situation of like 50 years or 60 years from now or whatever. And that's why, you could look at this and say, oh, those people who say 80, there's no hope for them. They just want to die at 80. How are you going to convince them? They must hate life. Why do they want to die at 80, right? Like that's one perspective that a longevity advocate could take, and you could be very frustrated by that. But in a way, you were asking like this kind of question that was setting them up for failure, because it was really asking about short-termism versus long-termism, which people are very weirdly circuited for. And even though it gave you some information about who might be the early adopters of a longevity mindset and a life extension mindset, it doesn't necessarily tell you that much about what people's perceptions could change to and what it would take to change their perceptions. And so these are very complicated. They're very nuanced topics.
So when you say people that answer, let's say 80, is it that they don't fully grasp like this long-term thing, and in reality everybody would want to live longer? Or do you think there are actually people that are like...
Right, exactly. I think everybody wants to live longer. So in other words, like somebody asked me a little while back, is everybody a vitalist, or could everybody become a vitalist? And, and initially my answer was, well, maybe not, because like, what's the distinction between like being a vitalist and not being a vitalist if anybody can just, be a vitalist immediately? I mean, there must be some distinction, but if you think about it, it's like you're peeling these layers and you have just more nuance and complexity. And the nuance is that in a sense, everybody already is a vitalist. Everybody does want to fight hard to live. And taking that perspective is a good perspective for us, because it increases our compassion and empathy. And by having compassion and empathy towards all other people, we have a better chance to elevate them to see something that we believe is right, and to basically encourage them to join us in fighting for what we think is right. So I want to say, yes, everybody's a vitalist at heart, or almost everybody. I mean, sure, some people are suicidal or whatever, and that's very sad. But the question is, how do we enlighten people and create a message that makes it clear that we can do things differently, and it's achievable to have a different approach that could yield much, much better outcomes. Now, with all of that being said, from a pragmatic perspective, we need to go for the low-hanging fruit first, which are those people who are already open-minded towards the notion of stopping aging with science and towards the idea of having longer lifespans. Like, obviously, you're kind of biased somewhat against that. It's going to be harder because now, you have to kind of negotiate these kind of preliminary ideas. But yeah, there you have it. A lot of nuance.
Yes. Thank you a lot, Adam. I really like this answer, especially to the last question. Okay. Is there any last thing you want to say to the people listening before we end this?
I'll just say that, we are so fortunate to be living in a time where there is science and technology, and where a growing number of people have the luxury to not be in a constant fight for survival and are able to even conceive of bettering our common situation in a way that's so fundamental as solving aging and solving death. And just want to encourage anybody who's listening to believe in yourself and believe in us as a community, as humanity, for having the capacity to reach these amazing new heights and explore levels of reality and opportunity and richness that other generations were never able to and couldn't potentially even imagine. And so if you are excited by that idea, and if you want to participate in that, I recommend you join us. Join us at Zelar.City, join us at Vitalist Bay, of course, join us at Vitalism Foundation and Vitalism.io. Be part of this amazing change.
So this was my conversation with Adam Gries. Here you find a video of me interviewing Victoria Forrest, the founder of Zelar.City. If you got interested in Zelar or in Vitalism, I put all the relevant links in the description. Bye bye.